I'd now like to welcome Melanie Bryan, OBE, as guest speaker. Melanie is a social entrepreneur and a great supporter of UnLtd and our award winners. Described by David Cameron as inspirational, Melanie was awarded an OBE in 2012 for her services to social enterprise in the Northeast. Melanie supports social enterprises, charities, businesses, infrastructure organisations and individuals to make a sustainable, positive difference. And thank you all for joining us. I'd now like to hand you over to Melanie.
Hello, good morning everybody. I hope that by now the echo's disappeared and you can hear me loud and clear. If not, do let Julie know. Okay, so it's the tendering. It's really interesting that public sector contracts have been talked about a lot recently, and the press coverage is both positive and negative. But one of the things that I absolutely love is the fact that people mistakenly think that it's only the big companies that win them, and that's so untrue. The reality is that out of those £236 billion of public sector contracts that are won each year, over 59% of them by value come to small businesses and social enterprises. So the reality is that we actually win more than the big guys do. We're just not very good at shouting about it. So one of the things that people often ask me is, what's a tender and how does that differ from doing a sales proposal or perhaps even a grant application? And it's quite simple. When you're doing a sales proposal to somebody in private sector, then you can usually produce anything that you want and you don't have any formal instructions to follow. So whether that's a document, you can put anything into it that you wish, you can add any marketing materials to it and so on. The difference with public sector tendering is that that tender is actually a formal document and it's issued by the public sector buyer, and they tell you exactly what they want to buy and exactly how you have to quote. So it's very, very specific. And people mix up the words tender and bid. There's a lot you'll hear people say I'm tendering for or I'm bidding for, but just so that you know, technically a bid is actually your written response to the tender. So the tender is a set of documents and the bid is then your written response to it. Now, one of the things that makes public sector tendering very different from private sector tendering is that in the private sector, if you bid for something, you can usually withdraw. And yes, you'd probably spoil your relationship and you may have issues there. But the difference is that when you actually tender for a public sector contract, then if you are awarded it, it's a legally binding contract to deliver the goods and services or the works that you've actually bid for. So that's really important to remember. I do get organisations that contact me and say, oh, I've won this tender, but I'm not going to deliver it. And you're thinking, no, you have to deliver it. And not only that, but in public sector, if you don't deliver it, are then able to charge you the costs of going all the way back through that procurement process to find someone who can. So it's really important that before you decide to bid for something, that you sit down as an organisation and you think through, can we really do this and can we really deliver it? And if we won it, are we in a position to start by the date that they specified? So if that's what a tender is, one of the other big myths about tenders is that it's all about price. Now, no one's going to deny that price isn't important because, of course, it is. But you can always tell how much importance a public sector buyer is putting on price by the way in which they've decided to award the marks. So within the documents that you receive, there will be a section on how we're going to evaluate this, and there will be a percentage allocated to price. Now, normally, for most of us on the line, we probably deliver primarily services. And in those instances, usually, price is 40% of the marks, and the remaining 60% are all about what you do and the way in which you do it. Sometimes you'll see it put down as 50-50, 50% price and 50% for the way in which you do it. And occasionally, you'll see it turned around the other way, 60% price and 40% on how you do it. Now, whenever I see something that's 50 or 60% on price, the first thing I will start to think about is, am I a low-cost provider in my marketplace? So am I going to come in as one of the lowest prices? Because if I'm not, then that particular contract probably isn't for me. Because one of the things that you need to always think about is, am I actually going to be able to deliver this for the price that they're saying? So is it going to be profitable for me? So, but one of the myths, therefore, is, if you think about it, if most contracts for services are 40% on price and 60% on everything else, it's not the cheapest one that's typically going to win. It's actually what the public sector calls the best value one. So what does best value actually mean? And my humble apologies to everybody there who may be vegetarian and is looking at that wonderful plate of meat and thinking, not for me, but it helps me to remember, because what public sector will talk about is the most economically advantageous tender. So that's meat, most economically advantageous tender. And the kind of things that they look for are all of these. So as price is in there, they're also looking at whether you're a low-risk option. They do look at whether you have a social impact, and these days with the Social Value Act, you will find actual questions on that. They look about how you're going to do this. They look about whether you're innovative, whether you've got great service, whether you're going to be convenient, and so on. So in reality, price is only one component. However, there are also two things that are really fundamental to any public sector contract. The buyer is thinking, will you deliver? And that's why they ask you questions about your track record. And, importantly, can I work with these people? And that's why they often put in an interview as some part, so that they can actually see you. So, before we get into how this all works, I think it's probably useful to think about some of the reasons why people don't win tenders. And it's interesting for me because I've been writing tenders now for over 20 years, and the reasons why people don't win don't really change year on year, which is always good for us because we can figure out how to get around that, but for the rest of the people it's probably not great. So, the first thing is, public sector tenders are very prescriptive. They tell you exactly how they want you to respond and exactly what you need to deliver. And the number one reason why people don't get through on tenders is they don't comply. So they attach things they shouldn't attach, they don't attach things they've been asked for, they don't answer the questions in the way in which they were asked. And a classic one there is where you're asked to provide a yes or no answer to a question, and somebody just goes down the list and goes, not applicable, not applicable, not applicable. And you're not compliant, and your tender won't be looked at any further. The second thing is that people forget when they're answering the questions that it's not enough to say you're good at something, you have to prove it. So what they're looking for in your answers are evidence. So that might be things about where you've done this before, it might be some case studies, it might be some anecdotal quotes from some of your satisfied service users, it might be some dimensions, things like volumes and so on. But they need that evidence to prove that you are what you say is what you actually do. Alongside that, I think we're all sometimes a little bit guilty of this, is that when people are writing their responses to tenders, they use phrases and jargon that the actual buyer doesn't understand. And part of this is because when people are writing tenders, they tend to assume that the person on the other end is an expert in what you do. But generally, particularly in the early stages, they're not. They're looking for specific answers to specific questions. So it's really important that you don't use jargon that they can't understand. And that's also things like abbreviations that they don't understand either. Another one further down the process is not picking the right team for the interview. It's amazing how many times you can snatch victory on that interview from somebody else who was actually marked higher than you. But conversely, it's also the time, if you don't perform well at the interview, where you can actually go the other way. So you might have been the leading one going into the interview and end up not winning it. So the choice of team at the interview is really important. And lastly, it's not about your handwriting, but poorly written responses. And, you know, the classics. People forget to spell check their actual tender. People actually cut and paste things and don't go through and check that they haven't used another client's name in it. That's one that is really going to upset your buyer when they're marking it. And it's simple things like that that actually result in people not getting through. So, one of the questions that I'm asked all the time is, I get all these emails telling me that if I pay the subscription fee, I'll find all these public sector contracts that I can bid for. And that's absolutely true. Those organisations that send you those emails, they have systems that will crawl through all the opportunities and present them to you in one email. So in that way, they can be really useful. But you don't ever have to pay to find out about a public sector contract. You just need to be registered on the right portals so that you actually get the notifications for those. Now, I couldn't possibly list for you all of the portals that are available for you to actually register on, so I've chosen the representative ones for you here. The first thing is that when you're looking for opportunities in the region where you're based, or in a specific region, then there will almost inevitably be a portal for the local authorities in that area. So here in the Northwest it's called the Chest, but if you put into Google procurement portal and then your region, so Northwest or Northeast or Scotland, wherever it might be, they will actually give that one to you. They're run by a company called Bravo Solutions, so if you also get stuck, if you put Bravo Solutions and your region in, it will usually send you to that portal. Some organisations have also started what they call Find It In websites, and these are for small contracts, so these are great if you're starting out. And within these, we have one here that's Find It in Cheshire and Warrington, there's Find It in Birmingham, and they're starting to come on board across other parts of the country. So if you put Find It In and your county, you may find that you have one of those as well. If anybody would like to bid for work with the police, then Blue Light was always the portal that they used. However, and this is a really interesting case study, Blue Light lost the tender to provide the portal for police procurement moving forward. There you go. So there are now new portals coming in for the police work, and they're coming in on a phased basis. So the best way to look at that is, again, is to put police procurement and your local police force into Google, and it will send you up. If you put Blue Light in that search as well, you'll find whether your police force is on there or not. So I've put one in here for the Northwest just to give you an idea of how that looks. Now, everybody who works with the NHS will know that there's been a huge change recently with them moving over to clinical commissioning groups. And this means that it can be quite hard to find the NHS opportunities at the moment. They're in a little bit of a state of flux. But anybody who wants to supply NHS, the first one there, which is procurement supply chain, is a good one to start with. And again, if you put Bravo Solutions NHS procurement in and your area, you should find the local one. Alternatively, just go to your NHS hospital website and put in procurement and see what you find. So that one is there, is the north of England, which is NOE-CPC at Bravo Solutions. You'll also find regional ones there. For example, here in the Northwest, there's one for the Northwest Consortium. Anybody looking to work with universities, always look on their website first and find out how they actually do procure. But there's also are some general ones using a host called Intent Host, and if you put in Intent Host and the name of your university, again, you'll probably find it. Similarly for the fire services, they have their own portals these days. That's the one for the Northwest, and again, if you put in your fire service in your region, you should find it. Now, anyone wanting to work with central government, it's fantastic these days because any contract over £10,000 has to be listed on this website, which is WK Contracts Finder. And they're also pushing now quite hard for local authorities to include all their contracts over £25,000 on there too. Anyone interested in working across Europe, then there's the one for Europe. If I've got any of you on here that are actually in the construction industry, you do have your own dedicated procurement portal. However, this one does have a subscription fee, and that's because they do a qualification of your organisation to make sure that you're fit for tender. Anyone looking at supplying schools with products, there's one there for you too. And if I've got any of my friends here from Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland, the ones on the bottom are the ones for supplying your public sector. So you never have to pay to find public sector contracts. However, if I have a top tip for you on this, it would be to make sure you're registered on all the portals that apply to you and your organisation. Make sure that you tick the box so that you get the email notifications, and set up a separate email account to receive those into. And the reason for that is that firstly they come in overnight, so if any of you leave your smartphones on by your bedside overnight, you're going to be hearing ping, ping, ping about 3 o'clock in the morning, which you probably don't want. And also they can clog up your inbox when they come in, so putting them into a separate inbox makes it actually a little bit easier for you to manage. So, you've registered on the portals, you've found a tender, and you go, yay, this one's for us. Or is it? It's really interesting how people fly straight into saying, I want to bid for this, without sitting down and really thinking it through. So, a couple of things that you might want to think about. The first thing is that in the public sector, one of the lovely things about them is that they tell you exactly what they want to buy. One of the bad things about that is they're not going to change that. So, the first thing to ask yourself is, can we actually deliver this? And if you can't, don't bid it on the hopes that you'll be able to change it later, because you won't. There's also a bit in there about, is there a showstopper? When you read the documents, is there anything in there that you couldn't respond to in the questions, or anything that would make you go, ouch? And one of the big things that might make you go, ouch, is if they talk about 2P, which is the transfer undertaking of protected employment. And that's where, as part of the contract, they are going to be expecting you to take on the staff of the existing provider. And that's an area that you really would need some expert specialist advice around. Can you win it? And part of that is, are you really prepared to put in the work to win it, as in the time that it will take to write the tender? Is it risky? Would you be able to overcome those risks? Do you need any help, whether that's to write the tender, for someone to check the terms and conditions of the contract, someone to help you with 2P? And very importantly, is it profitable? There's a big thing that people have. If public sector say this is the guide price, that they think that that's going to be a profitable contract. There are many instances where public sector has come out and said this is the price we're prepared to go to, and organisations simply haven't bid, and they've had to come back out later and say, look, we got that wrong, here's the revised price. But regardless, if it's not profitable for you to deliver, then don't do it unless you've got some really outstanding reason that I'm not aware of. So, the procurement process itself. Now, doesn't public sector love its own jargon? There is lots of jargon that goes around the types of process, and I'm going to make this really easy for you. When you see a contract, it will usually say this is being procured under the restricted process or any of the others that I'm going to show you. Now, the restricted process is very, very simple. It's just a 2-step process. They go through a pre-qualification questionnaire to get to a short list of organisations they would be willing to do business with, and then they ask those to tender. The open process, which is actually the most common one now, is where they combine those steps. So they have a questionnaire at the beginning of the tender, which you have to pass for the rest of your answers to be considered, but you have to answer the whole tender at one time. A framework. This is where they're looking for effectively a set of providers that they could go to over a period of time, and that's typically 2 years and typically has an ability to extend up to 4 years. So effectively, it's like bidding to become a preferred supplier on a preferred supplier list, and they will use either the restricted or the open process to actually tender for that framework. Now, frameworks are great because, of course, there's more than one person who wins effectively because there's more than one person on that framework. But on the other hand, it doesn't always result in the work that you were expecting. There's now a couple of new types of procurement process, but will be very rare at the moment, particularly as they've only come in this year. One is called an innovation partnership, and this is really interesting because a lot of the criticism of public sector has been that they only buy what they already know. So fantastic organisations like us, we've got really innovative ways of actually delivering things that absolutely know it works much better than what they're already doing, find it very difficult to win contracts. So the innovation partnership is designed specifically to help public sector to pay people to develop an innovative product or service. So it's really great for us if we can persuade a buyer to do it. Another one that you might see is competitive dialogue. If you do see this, I'd say think long and hard, because this is where public sector doesn't really know what it wants to buy. So it knows what the problem is, but it's not quite sure what the solution is. So it comes out to tender, will typically go through a pre-qualification exercise to find organisations it's willing to do business with. and then it asks you to present your solution. And over a period of time, you have some time with the public sector buyer, you actually refine your solution, but at the end of it, they choose the solution that they like best, and then they ask everybody who's still left in the process to bid to deliver that solution. Now that's great if you're the one whose solution is chosen, but for many other people who've been in the process, they would not be able to deliver the chosen solution if it wasn't theirs, and so it can be a very time-consuming exercise. And another new one that you're probably not going to see very much of is something called competitive negotiation, and this is where they'll go through an initial bid process and then they'll start to negotiate with you over aspects of your solution until, again, they come to a final part where they'll say, OK, now we want people to bid for this particular solution. So it's slightly different from competitive dialogue, but pretty much on the same lines. But from your perspective, the ones that you're most likely to see are restricted and open, and those are the ones that I'm going to quickly take you through. So the restricted process, if you remember, this is just a two-step process. All it means is that they're going to go through and ask you to fill in a pre-qualification questionnaire. And these are questions about things like your finances, your insurances, your health and safety and other policies, and it results in a short list of organisations that they're willing to work with. So at this point, they would then say to those organisations that are still left in at that point, we'd now like to invite you to tender. They'll then send you an invitation to tender, and this is all about how you're going to deliver whatever the service is and how you will meet their specified requirements, and will include your pricing elements and any interview or presentation. So all that it means is it's just a two-step process. This is how it works. Public sector will issue their contract notice. You'll ask for the PQQ documents, and usually these days that's just very simply pressing a button on a screen on a portal. You complete those documents and they mark them to create a shortlist. If you get through onto that shortlist, they'll send you the invitation to tender documents. You'll complete those, they'll score them, that usually includes an interview or a presentation, and then depending on the value, they'll either immediately award that contract or they'll go through a little extra step which says we intend to award this contract, which gives anybody time to actually come back and say we don't agree with that for some very good legal reason. You probably saw that recently when Richard Branson did it with Virgin Trains. So it's called the standstill period, and it's only 10 calendar days, and then they award the contract. And then all you have to do is deliver it. So it's simple. Now, the open process is even easier. If you remember, this is where they actually combine those steps. So you just get one set of documentation, and the first part of it will have something called a suitability assessment questionnaire, or it's sometimes called a business questionnaire, and that's effectively what were the PQQ questions. And as long as you pass that, then your second part of your response will be marked. But the difference here is that you don't know whether you've passed that suitability assessment questionnaire, and you have to answer all the tender questions from the outset in your bid. So the tender questions will then be the more detailed ones. So it's really simple. Here's how it works. You see that there's a contract, you ask for the documents, and you complete them. They mark them, and the first bit that they mark is your suitability assessment questionnaire. If you don't pass that, they don't look at anything else in your tender. If you do pass that, they then mark the remainder of the questions. Depending on the value, you might still have that standstill period, or they'll just straight away award the contract. So it's really easy. And then, of course, all you have to do is to deliver it. So, because the PQQ and Suitability Assessment Questionnaire, the SAQ, are actually pretty much identical, we can handle them together. And there are three types of questions on these. The first one are all about your financial and business standing. And these include questions like, do you money launder? Do you pay your taxes? Have you had any industrial tribunals, and so on? They're usually simply pass or fail questions, i.e. you either money launder or you don't, and no prizes for guessing which one they're looking for there. So it's simply a case of them deciding whether you've passed or failed by the answer that you give, which is usually only yes or no. So it's important you get it the right way around. On the financial standing, they will be looking to see whether you're sufficiently financially stable for them to actually offer you the contract. And as a rough rule of thumb, they would say that if the contract annual value is more than twice your annual turnover, then it's unlikely that you're sufficiently financially stable. So that's a good rule of thumb to keep in mind when you're looking at whether a contract is for you or not. Now, of course, if you failed at this point, they're not going to look at anything else within your tender. What they'll then look at are some of the policies and accreditations and insurances. So they may ask you some questions on health and safety, on equality and diversity. They may ask you questions on safeguarding, for example. The insurances, they'll certainly be looking for public liability insurance, and depending on what it is that you're actually delivering, also potentially professional indemnity insurance. You don't actually have to have the insurances in place, but you do have to tell them that you would put it in place before the contract started if you want. And again, these are usually a combination of pass and fail, i.e. you either have them or you don't, or they are scored. And scoring in particular comes into accreditations, which might be around your quality management system. So it may be that, like me, you're far too small to consider having ISO 9001, but you do have a great way of managing the quality of the work that you deliver, and that's where the scoring would come in. The third set of questions are about your experience and capacity, and these will always be scored and specific to the contract. So one of the great things about the PQQs and the SAQs is that once you've answered a couple, you realise that they all look pretty much the same. So you start to get a real feel for that, and you really should be getting through those every single time. So it becomes a little bit like a production line for answering those questions ultimately. But the invitation to tender documents, well, they're very different. There's a lot of information that comes with those, and if you're in that one-step process, the open process where it's all combined, you'll have all of this from the outset, and I actually think that's a good thing, because it really helps you to understand a great deal more about what they're looking for. And the background information is massively important because it gives you a lot of pointers to what their hotspots are, the things that you really should be hitting in your answers. They'll also give you the instructions on how to respond and how they're going to mark it. And this is so important, and the number of people who ignore it is amazing. There isn't very much leeway in public sector tenders. You really do need to do what they say. So if they tell you that you only have 300 words to answer a question, you need to answer it in 300 words. If you go over the 300 words, then they will simply cross through all the words beyond that and not take them into account. So it's really important that you understand what it is you need to do to respond, what documents, if any, you need to attach with your tender, and that you understand how they're marking it. Because when you look at the marking, you're looking at things like which are the key questions that carry the most marks, because they're clearly where you're going to probably spend your most time. What they'll also do is they'll give you a detailed specification which really explains what they want to buy. And this is a really great point to remind yourself again, do you really want to bid this? Can you really deliver this? They'll give you the questions that you actually have to answer. And they'll give you the contract and various schedules to sign, things like saying that you haven't bribed or corrupted any of their officials. Now, their contract conditions are not negotiable, so again, it's a case of take it or leave it. So if you're not familiar with them, it's great to get a copy and have a look at them. They're pretty much the same usually. But again, if there's anything there that causes you some concern, you're not going to be able to negotiate it after you've won. So again, that might be a go or no-go decision for you on whether you want to bid. So, let's assume you do. Well, here's the thing. Winning organisations start to prepare now. That's before they get their first tender. And here are some of the things that they do. They think about getting to know the buyer, because the problem when you're in the actual process itself is you can no longer talk to the buyer other than through the clarification questions, which are open to everybody. So one of the great things to do is, if you want to target a particular organisation, is to get to know their buying team and to start to talk to them about when they're next likely to come up with a contract that you might want to bid for, and to start to perhaps even influence them to think about solutions that would play to your strengths. So that's always a great place to start. Secondly, there's a really interesting one here. It's at the moment, lots of us, when we're thinking about our products and services, we think about them through the eyes of the people who use them. So that would probably be our service users or similar. But if you're going to tender, you need to think about them through the eyes of the person who's going to actually buy that service and what's important to them. And that can start to make you think a little bit differently. You know, what are the benefits to them? What are the features that are going to be most interested to them? How does it help them to solve their problems, and why would you be the best solution? It's also a great time to review what I would call your public profiles, and these days those are typically online. So if I Googled your organisation, or I Googled your key staff members or your trustees or whatever it might be, what would I actually find? And does what I find in there support what it is that I'm likely to want to be selling to public sector? And it's amazing what you find in there. So this is a really great time to go through and make all your privacy settings on any of those dodgy photographs on Facebook to make sure that none of the buyers can actually see it. It's amazing what they find when they look. Alongside that, you're going to be in competition with others on this, and it's really interesting here that people tend to only think about the competitors as being those that they compete with now. If you're going to be bidding for public sector work, you need to also think about who else might decide to bid for this, and in some cases this could be a national. So I have helped small local charities to beat off big national charities, but they often haven't thought about the fact that it might be a big national charity or similar, or a big private organisation that would actually decide to bid for this work. So it's really important to understand them, so you can think about why are you different and why should public sector buy you instead of them. It's also a great time now to start thinking about any partnerships and any relationships that you might want to build. Because often a great way to win public sector tenders is to combine your resources with another organisation and to work in something called a consortium. But those take time for you to get to know people and to go through your due diligence. So it's important to start thinking about that now. So before you get your first PQQ, there are some things that you can do to get ahead of the game. And the first one is, with those wonderful portals that you get, registering on them and getting comfortable with them is quite important. You can happily express an interest in different contracts, and you can download the documents so you can practice doing that without committing yourself to go any further. So it's really important that you understand those before you get your first PQQ. The second thing is that you can start to get some of that basic information you know they're going to ask for in order now. So things like your financial information, if you have to submit it, you're going to need to submit it electronically. So if you don't have it electronically, get it in PDF files from your accountants. Similarly with your insurances, you need your insurance certificates in PDF format so that you can submit them. And if you're thinking of bidding for public sector work and you don't currently have some of those insurances, you might want to check what the cost of actually obtaining them would be. You also want to get your policies in order and think about what policies are the public sector going to ask you for. And I can guarantee that they'll ask you something about health and safety, something about equality and diversity, and then it will kind of depend on the contract and it will depend on what you do. But you're likely to be asked about things like business continuity, quality, environment, and potentially safeguarding depending on what you do. It's also, if you're thinking of going into this large scale and you're a large organisation that might benefit from it, it's time to get accredited. So this would be things like quality management, so you might go ISO 9001 or perhaps Picasso, or for environmental it would be ISO 14001, but don't panic. I don't have any of those and I still win tenders. And most of my clients don't have any of those and they still win tenders because we have great alternatives. So the bit here is understanding what a quality management system is or an environmental management system is and writing your version of that so when they ask you, you know how to answer it, even down to simple things about what's your complaints policy. Alongside that, you're always going to be asked about your track record. So one of the things that you do need to do is to get yourself a spreadsheet or something similar and list all the pieces of work you've done, who you did it for, what their contact details are, start and end date, how much it was for, and a brief description of what it was. And if you have someone there that you know are going to be great references for you, then do make sure that you know where to find those people quickly and that they are willing to act as a reference for you. Because the way in which it works with public sector is you'll be asked to provide those references, but then if you are successful, they will go out to your referees without coming back to you first. So at that point, they're going to go directly to them. So it kind of helps if your referees actually know that they might be approached. And alongside that, based on what we said before, it's really important to gather your evidence too, because you want to be really, really sure that you've got those facts, those figures, your outcomes, your outputs, your case studies, your anecdotal quotes from your service users and so on that back up any answers that you might give. And we all know that can take a little bit of time to do. So once you know your first tender is actually coming, yay, I found one and I'm going to bid. It is that old adage, be prepared. It's going to take you time to do this, and you need to attack it as you would delivering any other project. So some things that you might do. First thing is to think about who's going to manage the whole process to make sure that your tender is really high quality, does everything it's supposed to do, fully compliant, and is submitted on time. Now, for some of you out there, you're thinking, yay, that'll be me, because there's only me. And I understand that, because there's only me too. But it's really important to factor in enough time for yourself to make sure that you can actually do that. For those of you where it's not just a one person, who's going to actually write the answers to each of your questions, and who's going to check those answers to make sure that they comply, they say everything you should say, and they're the best that you can do? Do you need any help? Because it's more frustrating for the people around you who could help you with this to be approached too late in the process for them to be able to give you the help that they should. Now, the help could come from many sources. It might be that you need to talk to your accountant to help you with the pricing. It might be that you need to talk to somebody from a legal firm to help you to understand the contract terms. It might be that you need somebody like me to help you to write the tender. Whatever it is, the earlier you get those people on board, the better. And also, very importantly, and trust me, I really, really get this, how are you going to free the time to write this? One of my biggest frustrations is when I have fantastic clients who come to me, and I know they'd be fabulous at actually delivering this, and I know public sector would love them, and they haven't left themselves enough time, and they just cannot do themselves justice in the time that they've left. And I know how difficult that is, because like you, I write my own tenders in the evenings and weekends, because I'm too busy doing them for clients the rest of the time. So it's really important you think about how you're going to free the time to actually do this. So when completing your tender, some things to think about. I know it sounds really basic, but read the pack very carefully. And I take a highlighter pen and I highlight all the key messages that they're giving me, so they're hotspots. I highlight everything I have to do to comply and so on in a different colour, and that really helps me to make sure I don't miss anything. And part of that too is that sometimes you find requirements that are hidden somewhere way down in the pack that weren't in the beginning where you would have expected to see them. Second thing is, again, I know it sounds very basic, follow the instructions. They're not negotiable when it comes to public sector. If you're at all unsure, ask a clarification question politely. It's better to sort of put your hand up and say, I don't really understand this, than it is to get it wrong. Oops. I lost one there, sorry. Never refer back. One of the things that people forget is that when public sector is actually marking your answers, it marks each answer in isolation. So the number of people I see who say in question 4, see question 1, they're not going to. They're only going to mark what's actually in that question answer. So never refer back, that's what that means. Always check your evaluation criteria and how they're going to mark it, because you really want to know which questions carry the most marks, and they're obviously the ones that you need to be really, really hot on when it comes to your evidence and so on. Answering all the questions, I know it sounds basic, but the number of people I've seen who put, there's only me so I don't do this, when they're asking, for example, how do you communicate health and safety to your team? If it carries 30 marks, you'll have to answer it as though you are communicating it to a team. And I know that sounds ridiculous. It's just one of those really idiosyncrasies that apply to public sector contracts. And be really, really careful when they're asking you for a yes or a no answer, that you are actually answering the question the right way round. And check you've completed everything and that you're fully compliant, because that's going to be massively important. So, very quickly, how can you get your common petition? Yay, you can all do this. The first thing is you need to complete a sample tender and keep it updated. So what I do is I have a whole series of documents that sit on my laptop, which are examples of questions that have been asked before and the best answer that I have to those questions. And that's important for you as you start to tender, because each time they give you feedback, you'll learn. And even if it's only that that's what that particular buyer likes, it's really important that you keep that going. I have what I call a library, and it's not one like that, it is files on my computer. But things like your latest policies, your latest accounts, your latest insurance certificates, so that you know you can go straight to those and have the latest versions immediately without having to spend time searching for them. If it's not just you, then getting your team on board and up to speed can be a little bit tricky, particularly if perhaps you're working with a board of trustees, is they need to understand what tendering is about and also what it means in terms of your time and strategically whether this is important for you or not. Getting some training or some help, really important to do that and to do it beforehand. It's really interesting. I can usually tell with clients that come to me that I don't know whether they've had any training previously or not. And the good news is, if anyone's interested, I'm starting some online training starting soon. And also, here's an interesting one that nobody ever knows about. Under the Freedom of Information Act, you can ask to see winning tenders from previous procurement exercises. So if this was a tender coming out perhaps that's already been let previously, then you can, under Freedom of Information, ask to see the winning tender from last time. You don't even have to do it through your company. You can do it through anybody can ask for it for any reason. So you could ask for it by get somebody who's not connected to your company to ask for it with a different name if you didn't want them to know that you were doing that. They will, of course, blank out anything that they consider to be commercially sensitive, but it's a fantastic way to get a feel for what a winning tender actually looks like. And just because I told you before that it can be done, I wanted to just quickly share with you some success stories that I know personally. The first one here, A Man for All Seasons, that's my husband's social enterprise. Yay! Award-winning and currently one of the Smallface 100, we're very proud to say. He's won contracts. He's just himself and one other person. He employs a learning disabled person. And they've won contracts of up to 25,000 and consistently. So, can you do it if you're really, really small? Yes, you can, but punch within your weight. Second one over there, you can see Vision up on the top right-hand side. That was a fantastic one. We snatched a big contract from a national charity. And they did it because they were very clever about spending enough time to actually get their answers right with me. But alongside that, financially, they shouldn't have been considered for this, but we ring-fenced some funds from their reserves, which satisfied the actual buyer on that one. So there's some interesting ways of getting around some of those rules of thumb as well. Manchester Care and Repair, this was fab. This was a collaboration with Age UK, where they went ahead and won a big contract in Wigan. So it goes to show, again, that you can have two that work together to deliver something. And the bottom one, this was an amalgamation that I put together, so it was a consortium of 13, actually, social enterprises, charities and small businesses to win a contract with Nestus. That was a contract with a big national organisation to deliver in the Manchester area, and we did it for 18 months. So the answer is, it doesn't matter whether you're large or you're small, whether you work on your own or you work with others, you really, really can win these, which is the message that I really wanted to leave you with. So, there you go, Julie. Absolutely on time.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Melanie. You certainly have given us some top tips, and we've got lots of questions coming through. I'm sorry, my recording is quite echoey, so I can bear with me. So the first question from David: are local authorities giving priority to social enterprises in their tendering process in accordance with the Social Value Act?
No, I don't think they are, if I'm going to be very honest. I think the thing about public sector is that when it's buying something, it has to be fair to everybody. So it's subject to national audit. So when they actually are evaluating a tender, they need to go through it and mark everybody to exactly the same criteria. So the way in which they are trying to do this is by putting in questions that are around social value. And there will almost inevitably be questions in there about social value. However, this is my caveat. What I find really interesting is that a lot of private sector organisations are very good at answering the social value question, and a lot of social enterprises are not so great at answering the social value question. So it's really, really important to think about the quality of the tender that you submit, the evidence that you provide, and how you really do answer those questions. I wish I could say it was a different way, but it isn't. The one way in which I have seen it being done really well in some areas is where the commissioners have met with the third sector and have put together tenders that are likely to be more attractive to the third sector. So, we talked about getting to know your buyer. some of them are quite forward-thinking in that and do get together with those. The other way in which they are really trying to help too, in many instances, is by making the contracts smaller. So rather than putting them into big contracts that are more attractive to other organisations, is making them smaller so that organisations like ours find it a little bit easier to bid for them, and perhaps it puts off some of the larger organisations too. So I'm really sorry I can't give the good news that you were hoping for there.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that. A question from Bryan. Do you need a self-employers tender?
Sorry, can you say that again, Julie? I couldn't catch that.
Do you need a set of employees to complete the tender? Can sole traders?
Oh, yeah, great question. Absolutely, sole traders can win. Until I incorporated my company back in last year sometime, actually, no, gosh, it seems like a long time ago, I was a sole trader and I won contracts. When my husband was a sole trader before he had a team, he won contracts. You absolutely can win contracts, but again, it's about finding the ones that are right for you. So one of the mistakes that a lot of sole traders make is that they try to go for contracts that are too big. So if you remember when I was talking about the annual value of a contract, that it shouldn't be more than twice your annual turnover, that's a really good rule of thumb in there. The other thing with sole traders is when you're answering the tender, a lot of the time the questions seem ridiculous to you. So when they ask, the example I gave was health and safety, wasn't it? But it could equally be around equality and diversity. When they ask you, how do you communicate this to your team? How do you make sure that every team member is trained? And you're looking and thinking, it's only me. You have to answer it as though you have a team, even though you don't. You've ticked the box somewhere further back that says you're a sole trader. They know you're a sole trader. And that's a lot about the way in which they write the questions. But yeah, I know lots of sole traders who win contracts.
Brilliant. A question from Hina. The financial suitability question put a lot of small organisations off. What's your advice for overcoming the financial suitability criteria when you're a small organisation?
Right. It's a little bit difficult. On the financial stability, the reason why they do it is because, of course, they want to make sure that you're actually going to still be there at the end to deliver the contract. So they work on this rough rule of thumb, as I was saying before. However, they are supposed to look at every case individually. There are some interesting things you can do, and depending on your organisation, remember that turnover includes grants in their eyes. So make sure that if you're looking at your financials, that you're presenting yourself in the best possible light. Part of that too is, depending on how you're constituted, is looking at the way in which you present your accounts. There are a lot of things you can do to make yourself look more attractive financially, and if you talk to your accountant, they can help with that. So if you're a limited company, for example, simple things like saying moving your director's loans from being current liabilities to longer term liabilities makes a massive difference to your financial ratios. So understanding some of those things can help. The other suitability criteria, they're pretty basic. They're things like, do you have these policies? Now, even if you don't have to have them because you're too small, have them. It won't take you very long to write them, but not having them means that you have to answer a lot of other questions, which is not worth doing. So, for example, if you're a sole trader, you don't actually have to have a health and safety policy, but having one means that you can tick the box that says I have one and avoid all the rest of the questions often. So it's thinking it through about how do I present myself in the best light, and taking on board some of that expertise that's out there to help you, because I know that, if you're an unlimited award winner, for example, I'm sure, Julie, that you can find accountants who can help people to understand that.
Yes. Brilliant. And a question from Cleo and Kevin, a very similar question. Are tenders suitable for startups? And from Kevin, how do you, when you've no financial track record and no public sector experience or evidence, break into public sector and deliver the services in a non-broken way?
Great question. Public sector contracts aren't really suitable for startups to bid for on their own, because the issue is you haven't got that track record. Now, there are some exceptions to that, and it would be, if you're looking at very small contracts, so things typically that would be under £10,000, public sector has quite a lot of flexibility about how it buys under £10,000. So in that instance, it only actually needs to take 3 quotes, and it can take the one that it prefers. So there's a little bit there about get to know your buyer really well and try to find some of those contracts that are under 10,000 to start off with. Another way to do it as a startup is to work in consortium with someone else. So effectively another organisation fronts the bid, puts their name to it, and you work as part of the delivery team, because that very quickly also gives you a track record and gets over that for you too. It is very, very difficult for startups to win public sector contracts on their own if it's over that £10,000 until they've been running for at least 12 months.
Okay, thank you. You answered Melanie question as well, because she was asking, do you advise partnership collaboration for a startup sole trader with background?
Absolutely, I do. Yes, and it's also really good for you anyway, because one of the things that I've found is that if you work in consortium and you go and you find the right partners, is that you tend to find that because you're already working for this, that other opportunities start to present themselves, which may or may not be public sector contracts, and you start to think a lot more about how you generate work as a team, as a wider team, rather than just individually. So I would absolutely say do that. The other thing is, don't be afraid to go and actually approach some of those other organisations that you know. In the beginning, when I was looking to win contracts in my own name, as Why Not Change, before I had any track record, I'd look and find a contract that I knew I could add value to, and then I'd think about who would be really good people that I knew to actually bid for that, and I'd go out and sell it to them, basically. So don't be afraid to do it the other way around. Don't sit there and wait for people to come to you, because they probably won't. Get out there and say, there's this really great contract. Are you interested in bidding for it? And if so, would you include me within your bid? You haven't lost anything, have you, if they say no?
Brilliant. So I've really enjoyed some great tips, and I think we've had all the questions. So I would like to thank you and hope that many of our listeners' questions have been answered today. I'm going to stop the recording now.